Yep, okay, good stuff. Well, as Christy mentioned, my name is Donna Hode, and I fancy myself an urban homesteader. I have lived in the city of London for my whole marriage. We back onto Oxford Street, and so we're definitely city. We're definitely urban homesteaders, or I am. My husband's built me some raised garden beds for in the backyard, and he's helped me to do some of those things in the backyard. So I do what I can with my little space that I've got. Unlike beekeeping, bringing up at a family gathering or a work party that you're into vermiculture is not going to win you friends and influence people. It's not nearly as cool, but for those people who do start it and try it, tend to be pretty passionate about their little, I call them my little furry friends. They're not supposed to be furry, they're not usually furry, but people tend to be pretty passionate. There's t-shirts online about worm farming and things like that. So you can get t-shirts for everything nowadays. But the great thing is, with not a lot of money, not a lot of time, you can you end up with a resource that's great to add to gardens and seed starting and such. So that's why I started predominantly, because it works for my setting, but it can also work in larger setups as well. So vermiculture is what we're talking about today, also known as vermicomposting, vermicasting, worm composting, or worm farming. If you didn't know what vermicompost was before, now you know we're talking about worms. And what is vermiculture? It's the scientific process of cultivating worms or artificial rearing of worms to decompose organic food waste into a nutrient-rich material. And it certainly is that. It's great for the garden and for plants. Why vermiculture? Why would I want to get into vermiculture? It's a good use of fruit and veggie scraps, and it's much faster than composting. Composting can take 6 months for the finished product. With vermicompost, it can take 8 to 12 weeks, and you've got a finished product. Certainly not the same quantities as an outdoor compost setup, but little bits at a time. I probably, in one bin, harvest about 2 pounds at a time, and I do that 2 or 3 times a year. So. And you can have as many bins as you want. So it makes good quality fertilizer for free once you're set up and going. It can be small or large scale to suit your needs and space. I did tell my niece about vermiculture and showed her my bins, and she's a young gal living in downtown Toronto in a teeny tiny apartment, and so she started a bin of her own and has it sitting back behind a chair in her teeny living room. So for her plants that she's got going. So you can use it in a really small space as well. Some people don't have huge setups in their garage or outdoors. So you can use it to suit your scale. Setup can be DIY and inexpensive, or you can purchase pre-made systems which are really quite lovely as well. So why worm castings? Worm castings enhance soil aeration and drainage and boost water retention of the soil. They introduce large numbers of beneficial microbes, bacteria, fungi, and humic acid, which aids plants in nutrient absorption. Worm castings contain 4 to 5% more nitrogen than garden soil, but it's in a slow release form because the castings are released with kind of a mucus, not to be too graphic, but there's a mucus covering them, so it's a slower release in your soil. They're also, beyond the nitrogen, high in phosphorus, potassium, iron, calcium, and sulfur. Of course, when you're doing in a home setting, it's harder to establish exactly what your levels of all of those are, but that tends to be the trend. And nutrients and trace minerals and elements are reduced to their most usable form because of the way that the worms digest the elements, and it tends to be a neutral pH of about 7. So red wiggler worms are the worm of choice for vermiculture. They're the best for a variety of reasons. They they like to live in the top layers of the soil. In a bin like this, you would have 4 to 6 inches at the bottom for your bedding and then your worms, and we'll get into that afterward. But you can have a bin this size. It doesn't have to be a huge bin because the worms are near the surface and they're doing the digesting there, so it works. They're a perfect worm for this purpose. They're not like some of the night crawlers that dig deeper down, that you need a deeper vessel to keep them in. They do okay with other worm species, but they're also, red wriggler worms are fine with being in close contact with other worms. Some worms are more territorial and spread out and don't want to be near each other, but these ones thrive being together. If you have a piece of a banana peel or whatever and lift it up, you may have like just a handful of worms under that one piece, and they're all mixed in together. They're fine with being close together like that, and will reproduce in a bin like that. Pardon me. Red wrigglers can be purchased online through Facebook groups or on Marketplace, through word of mouth. Word of mouth is a great way to do it because, like everything else, I have found that they seem to have really gone up in price, like everything else. One place that I was recommended recently is called Mother Worms, that I just looked up last night, actually, if anyone's interested in purchasing Mother Worms. Looks like they're really good. They deliver. They're in kind of the Kitchener area. For bins this size, they say a few hundred worms. You can buy a quarter, and I do have up there that a pound equals 1,000 worms. So you would need about a quarter to a half a pound of worms for a bin like this. A quarter pound is about $18.99, just to give you an idea of price-wise. If you were purchasing online, a half a pound, $29.99, or a full pound is $58.99. If you wanted to start a few bins at once, or if you were interested in going in with a friend and splitting your worms, that would certainly cut down on the price. It's advisable to start smaller, with like a pound or less to start your first worm bin, because if everything is going well, they'll tend to reproduce and double in their population every 90 days. So you will be growing your bins. I started off with, pardon me, it was maybe a quarter or a half of a pound from a gal that I just was chatting with on a Facebook group, on a foraging group, and brought them home. And I started off in just a big protein container that we were recycling, and put mesh over the lid, and gradually, and that's not the way I would recommend to start, but I just was able to get the worms. It was like, okay, now what do I do? And then research. So I started off that way, and now I'm up to four bins like this. So, yeah. So red wrigglers are the best way to go. So there are lots of different pre-made systems that you can find, and they're really quite lovely in comparison to these bins. But like the Hungry Bin worm composter, urban worm bag, the worm hut, one of the advantages with a system like that is that you harvest from the bottom. So you're feeding at the top, harvesting from the bottom. So it's just a lot simpler, and we'll get into the harvesting after. But you're going to pay for it, obviously, looking at the prices. For these ones, the tubs are about $15 each, and then the price of your worms. So and you do really recoup that quite quickly. Within a couple of harvests, you've paid for all of you that you've put into it. And some of these look like they're probably made to go on the countertop and such, and they're quite lovely. But I decided to go the DIY route. And this is my system. That's just my seed starting table in the basement. And so those are the bins. That was before I added one more bin. The recommendation is to start with one bin that has holes drilled in the bottom of it, and put another one underneath to catch any leachate. If your bin is running properly, you shouldn't really be having enough moisture to be needing to catch leachate, but it's just kind of an added security, I guess, in case your bin does get a bit too damp, and then you just want to take care of your worms and make sure they're not sitting in pools of moisture. But yeah, so I started off like this, and now I'm experimenting with the next bin. I didn't put holes in the bottom, and I thought I would do that so that instead of needing 4 bins to do two worm bins, I only had to purchase 3. So I'm experimenting with that just to cut costs a little bit. So those are my setups. As you can see, it's really important to have holes drilled in the top for airflow for the worms, and also in the sides and the bottom of your first bin. Oops. And I put, in the bottom of my first bin, I've just put yogurt tubs just to leave a bit of a spacer so that there's more airflow through there. And the first step when you're building out a worm bin is your bedding. The worm bedding isn't something that needs to be changed out. They actually eat the bedding as well as the food that you place in. There are lots of different ingredients that you can use for that. Some people will use peat moss, cocoa coir, pardon me, newsprint, cardboard, paper, straw, compost, dead leaves, composted mulch or leaf mold. It's important to have some elements in there like a leaf mold or compost that already has some of the microbes that would be in the soil, just to get your worm bin going. Here, to start this new bin, I used cocoa coir on the left. You start off with, I don't know how many people have used cocoa coir, but it's just in a compact brick like this. It's important to get something that's been rinsed already because it can have a high salt content. And so then you just soak that in water. When you're adding it to your bin to start your bedding, you want to really make sure that it's wrung out. It should be the moisture level of a wrung out sponge. You don't want it to be holding on to too much moisture. Something else that is really promoted is using shredded paper as a way to just deal with some of our paper that we're recycling and such. I do use sometimes just the paper bags, something without print on it, and just shred it up in the paper shredder. And again, you want to soak that so that it's quite damp. I tend to not like to use too much paper. I put it in to just use to have a little bit of something extra for the worms, but it's really better to use something more natural. I think it's better for the worms. You also end up with a higher quality vermicompost when you're finished if you're using more natural products. So I think most people have things around the house, like the third picture is just mulched leaves that I added into the base. These are pretty fine, but I've also put in just whole leaves even, and just crunch them up a little bit when I put them in, as long as they're dry. And then at the very end, that's some of the worm compost that I dug out of the bin. Just to get it started, I took some compost that I had existing from one of my bins and added it in to the bedding, just to get it going so that it has some of those microbes already. So these next pictures are a little bit out of order. So I'll do my best here. The first one here is just the cocoa coir that was soaked and dampened. And then the last one over here on this side is where, and it's a little bit hard to see it, with these, I apologize. It has all of those other elements added in. It had the vermicompost, the leaves, the cocoa coir, and the paper all just mixed in to make a nice bedding. And they do seem to thrive in kind of having a lot of different materials. But when I have started it with just the recyclable paper, or like the brown paper I prefer to use, they do fine in that as well. But they do like the more natural elements. And on this next one, it is really tricky to see. I apologize. Oh, I'll go back here. The middle slide, I'm adding eggshells, just powdered eggshells that I've made from cleaning my eggshells. I boil them, bake them, and then put them through the food processor to make a powder out of them. And the worms do need some kind of grit added to to the system. I usually sprinkle that right on top of the bedding. They need that because they don't have teeth and they need it for digesting. So you can use that. Some people also use agricultural lime, and both help with the alkalinity as well in the system, so that it doesn't become too acidic. And so I find once in a while, if I just find that maybe the worms are going through the food a little bit more slowly, or if it looks really damp, then I'll add some more of the eggshells. I do find that it's, and this might be similar to what Corey was saying as well about the bees, it becomes a little bit intuitive, where the more you observe and just watch your bin, you'll figure out what you need more of, if you need more bedding or more leaves on top, or if you need more moisture, if you need more eggshells. And online there are so many resources that I even just type in, what do I need when my worm bin is whatever, and it's there. Like someone has figured it out and thought of it. So that's always very helpful. And so the far right slide, that's where I did add in some of the worms. If you were to purchase worms from a worm provider, you're going to have just like a bag of worms. There will be a little bit of bedding mixed in, but you would see a big bag of worms or a big pile of worms. That is mixed in. The middle slide is a close-up. And some of the worms, they don't like the light, so they are they're kind of burrowing down pretty quickly and didn't really want to be in my flash of my camera. But yeah, I took those directly from another bin, so that's why as well. I just took them like compost and all to add them to the new bin, so it's kind of hard to see. I apologize. As well, as soon as I was asked to speak on vermicomposting, I was looking at my bins and saw that my population had gone way down. So it's like, as soon as you agree to talk about it, you all of a sudden don't have like a huge amount to show. So I apologize about that. But certainly they are pretty resilient, and it's easy to then again just take more care, and you'll build up your population again in no time. I may purchase a few more, but I'm pretty confident that they'll just take care of that themselves. So on the left-hand side, again, they're kind of out of order. That just shows I usually put more leaves on top just to finish off. And when I'm feeding, I take just a spatula that I keep for the worms and pull back half of the leaves, and then put the food there, and then cover it back again with the leaves. That helps to prevent fruit flies and different things from getting in. There's usually zero odor to this, which is fantastic. But I do I don't know, it just seems like it keeps it cleaner and keeps the moisture levels at bay and such. So if you were to start a worm bin, it's recommended that you keep the lid off for the first night and maybe keep a light shining in there. The worms don't always love their new environment and will sometimes start to climb up the sides to try to escape. I have found the odd dried up worm on my basement floor, unfortunately. Then I'm like, oh, sorry, little guy. But my husband always jokes that I'm going to open it one day and something's going to pull me in, because it hasn't happened yet, but so yeah, anyways, if you keep the lid off for the first night and the light shining in there, that'll force them down into their bedding, and they become acclimatized to their new environment, and they don't try to run away on you, so, which isn't good for them anyways, because they don't fare very well on the basement floor. So feeding the worms is always a big question. What they like, what they don't like. There are so many things you can feed to your worms. I love it, especially in the winter time. I don't always have to go out to my compost pile to put my scraps. I'm able to just take them downstairs. I typically only feed once a week. They say that a pound of worms will go through a pound of food in a week's time. Some people advocate feeding every couple of days in smaller amounts. That might prevent mold, which I rarely have that. It's only if I've put cooked rice in, and that did go moldy, so I wouldn't recommend putting in cooked rice. But for the most part, I don't deal with mold as an issue. But it does keep your, sorry, I lost my train of thought on that one. It does keep the dampness down. So feeding the worms tea bags, even in the bag, is fine. Coffee grounds in the coffee filter is fine. I've got, you can see what's there. There's apples and apple cores, and if seeds are in there, that's fine. Sometimes they'll start to grow, but you just pick them out, and it's really easy to deal with. Oh, I remember what I was saying. I'm sorry. Some people do try to feed every couple of days, just so that you can keep a closer eye too on how are the worms doing. Especially if you're just starting out, it's maybe advisable to feed them every few days. And I was feeding once a week, but I was still checking them daily initially because I didn't know how to do it, and I was a bit concerned about if I was doing everything right. So it really is not that difficult, though. So that's the food. They do enjoy most fruit and veggie waste: eggshells, tea bags, coffee grounds, and filters. You want to, just like with a regular compost pile, you want to stay away from fats, meats, dairy, bones, any plants that may have pesticides on them. I do find in the summertime it's super easy, because when I harvest carrots and bring them in, the carrot tops go in here. It's so easy in the summertime. There's obviously an overabundance, but they don't tend to like potatoes. They always stay away from potatoes and potato peels. You want to use very little of your alliums, your onions and garlic, also citrus, things like some people will put in cereals and bread and pasta. I tend to just keep it to something that's been growing on my property, or organic food that we've purchased at the grocery store, and just the carrot tops and the apple cores and things like that. I also find tomatoes sometimes, or like just really high moisture items like that, can really cause your bin to become more moist, or if it doesn't get broken down right away, or the worms don't go right to it, then you might end up with some mold in there. A little bit of mold isn't the end of the world for your bin, but I like to keep it not too damp. So, and I do tend to, even though they say you can use some onions and garlic and mix them in with other foods, I just don't like the smell of them in the bin, so I've always stayed away from that. So, if I have found, though, if I'm short on something to throw in, I have put in dried rice in the past, and they do like that, but I wouldn't put in cooked. So the harvest now. This part was a bit of work figuring out, and initially I wanted to know everything when I started, but I just had to get it going and let the worms start creating. When you get to the point where all of the bedding has been consumed, and it's really cool, even the shredded paper, you look in the bottom and dig down under in it to check on the worms, and it's like, there's no bedding left. This is so cool, and it's amazing how quickly it happens. But then you're at the point where it's like, okay, I can start to harvest now. So when I first started off, there were lots of different ideas that I saw. One was to take a black garbage bag and lay that out and just dump out your bin. Actually, backing up a little bit, you'd want to starve your bin for a couple of weeks so that the worms have to use up every last little bit and kind of clean up the bin a bit. Then you can dump the material onto a black paper garbage bag and either have it sitting outside or under a bright light. And then the idea is that the worms go into they bury and dig into the middle of the pile, and so then you're harvesting from the top and sides and putting that into a bucket, and then you keep the light shining for another 20 minutes, let them dive into the middle, and then come back and do it again. And that's a bit labor intensive, and that was a lot. So I'm like, there's got to be a better way. I did try, this may seem funny, but I tried many different things. I tried an onion bag and putting the compost in and shaking it to try to get out the little bits. And worms don't like vibration and to be shaken. And I thought, for the worms in there, that is just so not fair. And it was like more work than even the pyramid of compost. And I tried shaking it through even a plant pot. And that was just a lot of work. But finally, I did find a system that I like. This one on the left-hand side, I just have shredded paper on top because I needed something quickly to add in. Also, just an aside, I usually put leaves on the top, and I can, as we saw on one of the last screens, but I think that my leaves that I brought in the fall had the roly-poly bugs in them. And so I'm wondering if that contributed actually to my decreased population of worms, because I think they're eating through the food faster than my worms were, and so they didn't have as much. That's my guess. There are a few options, but so I took a little break for a bit. I thought, okay, I don't want to bring in any more worms. These roly-polies are, plus they're, I don't know, they're kind of gross to dig out, but they're not going to hurt the bin, but they'll probably go through the food faster than the worms. So what I've started doing is I'll pull aside the top bedding, I guess I'd call it, and I start feeding on just one side of the bin at that point, and I do that for 2 to 4 weeks, something like that. So basically, all of the worms will gravitate to one side of the bin over the course of that time. They usually finish up what's on the one side and then gravitate over. That it would seem like a lot of work to harvest one bin like that, because you're not going to get a huge amount all at once, but because I have 4 bins going, I can do that in 4 bins and get a good amount of compost to use. Then at that point, I just start scooping out the compost from one side, and I use this screen. This is just the plastic chicken wire, so it's yeah, I feel like it's maybe a little gentler on the worms, and there shouldn't be too many, but sometimes you'll still have the odd little straggler that's hanging out by themselves on the other side. That's a good size that I can just put it right over top of my 5-gallon bucket, and it actually doesn't take too much work with your spatula or spoon just to kind of run the soil, or even just my hands just to run it back and forth gently, and then any larger pieces here we go, any larger pieces of leaves or whatever you may have left will just stay on top. You can see in the middle I've got a couple worms there that were still hanging out in there. I don't know if we can see that. There's a little worm up here, and there was another one someplace. But so then I just gently pull those off and throw them back into one of the bins, because I don't want to hurt any of them in the process. But then on the right-hand side is the vermicompost that I came up with. At that point, you might want to strain it through something finer, just to get out any other bits that has some of the shredded paper in it. I harvested it a little bit earlier just because I wanted to show the process for today. But for a home application, it's not a big deal if you've got some of the little bits of paper or leaves or whatever, and it's still, because if you're throwing it in your garden or seed starting mix, it's only going to add to it. It's not going to hurt anything. So if you were selling it, for sure, you would want to make sure it's really well filtered. So now what? Oh, actually, if I can just go back. This is something I would like to try as well that I recently saw, is using a 3-bucket system with just 5-gallon buckets. And again, this would be really cost effective because they're only like $5 each, plus a lid is a few bucks. But so drilling holes in the bottom. I didn't drill as many in this as you would need to get started, but having your catch bin at the bottom, and then putting the next one in. This middle bin would be the one that you fill 4 to 6 inches with bedding, and then add your worms. and then a little bit more of a bedding on top just to cover them and kind of balance your moist and your dry elements. And then cover that with a lid. Then when you see that the worms have gone through the bedding in this bin, then the idea is adding a second bin on the top, or a second bucket that has holes drilled in it, and putting that right on top. And the size of the holes for something like this would be 1/4 inch. And then the idea is that the worms will migrate from the bottom bin to the top bin, which is how some of those fancy schmancy systems work that are easy for harvesting. So the idea is that they'll gravitate up, and of course having a lid with holes on the top as well. I haven't tried this yet. I'd like to see if it's easier. The idea is that your middle bin should be completely composted and ready to go, and all or most of the worms should be out of that. Also, for ease of harvesting, you would take off your top bin, remove this one, and harvest your compost, and then just put this bin on top. So this becomes your bottom bin, and then it's just kind of a never-ending cycle. So I think that sounds kind of cool too, but I might try that with the larger ones just because it just fits with my setup that I've got going on. So now what? Now that you have these beautiful this beautiful compost, these vermicastings, what can we do with them? They're used for lots of different purposes. People make aerated worm tea with them. I'm not sure if people are familiar with aerated worm tea. You use a 5-gallon bucket, and you put in about a cup or so, however much. I'm not too technical on it. I haven't tried this myself personally, but wrap that up in some muslin or cheesecloth and hang that inside of your bucket. I'll bring my prop back up just to, not that it's going to help me that much, I guess, but so you'd have that hanging in your bucket, and then fill your bucket with non-chlorinated water that you've let sit out or filtered, and then adding 1 to 2 tablespoons of molasses to it to add a sugar source. And then the important thing for an aerated worm tea is the aeration, so adding in some kind of a pump to get the water bubbling and moving. And people will leave that outdoors or in a garage for 24 to 36 hours, and it increases the microbial activity in the tea. And then it's really important, if you're doing something like this, that very soon after you stop, stop aerating it, you want to use it right away before the microbe population starts to decrease again, because it does so quickly apparently. So that can be then filtered out and used as a foliar spray on your plants. You can also use that to just pour around the roots to do a root drench. Also a simple worm tea. I have done that. I haven't started with the pump yet to aerate the water, but a simple worm tea where I basically just leave the castings sitting in the bottom of the bucket. I don't even worry about wrapping them in the muslin because the water's not going through a pump. Let it sit for about 24 hours, and then just pour that through my garden watering can onto or around the plants, and then just what's left at the bottom, I just pour that in too. It's really not too scientific, and like I said, just kind of intuitive. We just find what works, right? So you can also use it to top dress or side dress your plants. It's also been used as a garden amendment. MI Gardener uses it, as many people do, but you can take about a 2-pound bag, and that covers a 4x10 raised garden bed if you have raised garden beds. And it doesn't have to be a thick layer, just a thin layer, but he does that in the fall to kind of get the microbes kind of into the soil and such for the next season. Again, I tend to put it in when it works for me, and when I see that the plants need something. It's not my full-time job. I'm a homeschooler and such, and it depends when I've got the castings, when I've got the time to harvest them, when I've got a minute. So that's what I just tend to do, as I'm sure most people here that's how life works, right? I do love it as a transplant fertilizer in the spring when I'm planting my tomatoes and such. I just take maybe a cup or so and put it in the bottom of the hole and then plant whatever I'm planting. You can add about 10%, make a seed starting mix by adding about 10% of your vermicompost to an existing seed starting mix, or just even adding it when your seedlings are starting to get larger and they need a bit more, they've used the nutrients, or you're not able to pot up yet, adding some of this to the top of your pot, or watering again with the simple worm tea just gives some added nutrition. You can also store, apparently if you store it correctly, and I've never done this, but you can store the vermicompost for up to a year in 5-gallon buckets, just as long as they're in a cool, dark spot, but they're moist, but they're also, but not too moist, but they're also ventilated. So it's like, if you have all of that in balance, then you can store them for about a year. Yeah, and of course adding to house plants and just you're not, unless you have a huge system, you're not going to get bags and bags and bags of it. For larger applications, some people might think, oh, I don't know that that's going to work for me. I feed my chickens all of my scraps or whatever it may be, but it certainly does have its benefits for adding to your seed starting, or just if you've got kids, they might like to take care of it. Even that can be their job, to help with taking care of that. And if you homeschool, it can be part of the life cycle and things like that. So there definitely are applications for small and large scale, I would say, but it depends what works for your system. So troubleshooting, honestly, I haven't had too many problems with my worms. Like I said, there's lots of information online, and you just watch what's happening with your worm bin and adjust what you're doing. Add more paper, add more leaves, whatever it is that you need to do. The big thing you need to watch for is moisture level in your bin. If your worms are overfed, that's when you can end up with fruit flies or too much moisture or mold. So it really comes down to moisture levels and how much you're feeding. So if you're not feeding them too much and you're feeding them enough, if you're feeding them enough, your bin shouldn't become too dry, and your populations should be increasing. If you're feeding too much, that's when you can end up with some of the other problems. If you do end up with a lot of leachate, you're feeding too much, or there's too much moisture in your bin. Sometimes people will freeze some of the food, if they have excess food that they don't need it yet, but they've got it on hand and want to use it in the worm bin. One benefit is that it breaks down the cell walls in the food by freezing, so the worms are able to break it down more quickly, but also if your bin tends to be more on the damp side, when you thaw the food, pour out the excess liquid and then add the food to the bin, so that you're not ending up with as much liquid in the bin. Fungus gnats, I have had to deal with once. It's okay to have a few fungus gnats, so that's not a problem, but there was one day that I looked in my bin and I did have a lot of fungus gnats. So again, went to Google, and Google had my answers. But you can put a piece of bread in, and that attracts all of the fungus gnats, and then just take that out, and you'll probably have dealt with what you need to, or just leaving your bin out in the sun for a little bit to dry up a little bit. So again, if there's too much moisture, that's when you're going to end up with fungus gnats. So it's really quite easy. The things you need to watch for: is it too moist? Is it too dry? If it is too dry, and you'll know that by squeezing it. If it's too wet, if you're getting any drips coming out of a handful, if you squeeze it, you can tell as well. If it's looking too dry, you'll notice that the worms are kind of lethargic, or not eating as well, or they don't have that shiny sheen to their skin. So then just take a fine mist spray bottle and just spray some moisture in a little bit over the course of a couple of days, and that should help to take care of that. Yeah, that's That's the big thing, really, is just watching how much you're feeding and watching your moisture levels, and that really does. And is there an odor? And that really helps you to keep your worms healthy and producing for you. Other considerations are temperature. The best temperatures for red wrigglers is between 13 Celsius and 32 degrees Celsius. So you can put a worm bin outside. You are going to have, you need a lid on it, certainly. They suggest maybe not having holes in the lid because you don't want rainwater to get inside, but you do need to have enough ventilation, so extra holes on the sides. You will end up with spiders and other critters getting in there as well, though, if you have it outside. I've never done that. You also want to have it in the shade if it's outside. It works really well for me having it in my basement, but lots of people do it outside. Some people have used old freezers, like a huge deep freezer, and they have that filled with their worms, and it's amazing what different systems are out there. Moisture level, as I said, is about 60 to 70% moisture, like a wrung out sponge. Oh, and for worms being outside, I apologize, I'm jumping around a little bit. If you're keeping them outside in the winter time, apparently you can do it. I had heard that that you don't want them to be outside in the winter time, that the worms will die, the red wrigglers will die. Apparently the cocoons will survive, but I don't have experience with that. So again, it would be one of those trial and error things that you could start with a bit outside and a bit inside if you were interested. So yeah, I think that is, oh, actually there was one more slide on inspiration and resources, and hopefully this is what we'll end up with by adding some of this compost to our gardens. Is a lush garden. These are some of the people that I've followed over the couple of years that I've been doing this, and also some people that I looked to for more inspiration and information for today. So Urban Worm Company has a free ebook that was really good, so that would be one to look up if you're interested. The Worm People, M.I. Gardner, I've watched a lot of his videos. Hey, It's a Good Life is a new one to me that I've just started watching over the last little bit, but she has a lot of in-depth information too. Epic Gardening and Hollis Farm LLC is where I found the information on the 3-bucket system. Those were all YouTube channels. The New York City Compost Project was really interesting. I was amazed. I printed this off. It was a tip sheet, a worm bin troubleshooting guide that had lots of information. And it's New York City Compost Project, founded by the New York City Sanitation, or funded by New York City Sanitation. I thought that was kind of cool that they were encouraging that. And then Planet Natural Research Center had more of the kind of technical information on worms and just the kind of sciencey stuff that I don't know as much about. But anyways, that is all for my presentation. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions about worm composting. I did bring these guys in, so if anyone wants to come up and take a look, they can. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, please use the mic.
What was the ideal temperature you said to keep them at?
Oh, so it said between 13 and 32 degrees Celsius. I've seen a couple of different sources, though. One said 13 is the best, the ideal temperature, but then someone else said 20 degrees Celsius is ideal. So again, trial and error, and just, I think fluctuating temperature is the big thing. One thing I wonder about when I lost some of my worm population is I decided hoping to make my basement look a little less messy because it's in the corner of my husband's and son's workout area, so I'm trying to share the space nicely, was to try to stack the bins, but I had them going like alternating directions, and I was pretty comfortable with the amount of airflow, that they were still getting enough airflow. Maybe they weren't, but I'm wondering the top ones, it was actually, there's quite a bit of difference in the temperature between the higher ones and the bottom ones on the floor. I have no idea, but I think they are a little bit of delicate creatures, I guess. They don't like fluctuations in temperature. They don't like a high commotion area and noise and vibration and such, so you wouldn't put it on top of your dryer or something where they're going to be, heated and shaken or, yeah, if that helps.
I have two questions just to add on to about the temperature or airflow. Do you add a fan or anything like that, or just air in the basement is fine?
I haven't added anything in the past. I haven't needed to. I know some people do talk about using a fan. I haven't needed to. But I think probably if you're, a couple of my bins are running dry lately, surprisingly. This guy that doesn't have the holes in the bottom is one of the ones that's running dry again. This is one of the ones that has the little roly-poly bugs. And so I'm wondering if they're eating the food quicker and so there's less moisture. But certainly if your bin was running more on the moist side, a fan would be a great idea, I would think.
My second question is, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's another system, maybe, per se, you use outside. It's green. You can dig a hole and put it in there, and you compost from the top.
Okay.
Have you seen that before?
I think that I came across that recently when I was looking up information for today, but it's kind of beyond what I'm personally interested in doing, so I didn't look at it too closely.
Okay.
Yeah,
Basically, I was going to ask, does that promote a lot of worms around that area? Or I guess you haven't looked at that. So
that would actually make sense because they do talk about the fact that once you're adding more microbes to the soil, that also attracts more worms. So how large was it and how deep? Do you know?
I think it's about 1.5 feet, maybe deep.
Oh, okay. So is the idea that you can move it to different parts of your garden to encourage?
I think it's just in one central location. I was just curious.
Okay.
How much would it feed? Like, would it be
Yeah.
like an, 10 by 10
Yeah,
area of
I'm
worms?
not sure. I apologize.
Yeah.
I don't
Oh,
know
that's
that
okay.
one. Do you feed it from the top still?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure, but that does sound really interesting. Yeah. I think it would be different too because you're encouraging earthworms instead of this type of worm. I'm not sure.
I was actually thinking the same thing because that green bin's out in the church garden. Yeah, and I'm like, could I put the worms in it? But if you want in the spring to dig up around it to see if there's more worms, you can. But I think the mesh that comes with it, the holes are probably too big, so the worms can go through it. So in my head, I was like, I could put those in there, but then they'd probably leave eventually. But yeah, that I don't know. That doesn't really answer your question. But if you want to dig out there and see if there's more worms, you're welcome to.
Okay. Thanks very much. If anyone wants to come and take a look at my little friends, you can. That's fine.